All right, so let's go ahead and get started on 5.2, which is the executive branch. So you're going to do we're going to do the entirety of the executive branch in this slideshow. So let's go ahead and get going. So um, to start off talking about the executive branch, we have to start with the framers of the Constitution. So the framers of the Constitution had this big fear of tyranny. They didn't want another King George, but due to the kind of lack of a chief executive during the Articles of Confederation, which was kind of exemplified through Shays' Rebellion and a few other events, the framers of the Constitution knew that when they created the new Constitution, they had to include an executive branch. They had to include some chief executive, which becomes the president. Now, what they also needed to do, remember, is they created the various separations of powers and the checks and balances that would be in place enough in order to stop that chief executive from becoming too powerful. So that is what they did. So let's go into what we talk about when we talk about the executive branch. So first off, primarily when we're talking about the executive branch, we are talking about the president. So there are only three formal requirements to being the US president. You have to be 35 years old or older. You have to have been a natural born citizen, so born in the US, or there are some exceptions, like, for example, if you were born on a military base that is controlled by the US, things of that nature. But you have to be a natural born citizen, and you have to reside in the US for 14 years prior to running for president. Besides that, there are no other requirements to be president. Now, informally, there are like informal requirements in that most presidents have been many of these things. So most presidents, pretty much every president besides Donald Trump, has had some level of experience inside the U.S. government, some more than others, right? So on the lower end, you've got like Barack Obama and John F. Kennedy, who were both senators, but never did more than that. Then you've got, for example, the current president, Joe Biden, was vice president for 8 years, was a senator for much of the rest of his career, a large amount of experience. Generally, when it comes to socioeconomic status, as you would probably assume, presidents tend to be wealthy as well as pretty highly educated. Um, every president we've had has been a man. All of our presidents, besides one, have been white. The vast majority of presidents we've had have been Protestant. In fact, the first Catholic president wasn't elected until 1960 with John F. Kennedy. Not all presidents, you know, have their religious practices be part of who they are as president, but some do. Presidents almost always have been married throughout their entirety of their presidency. Um, they generally are always a member of the majority party, and they generally have a large amount of charisma and are fairly photogenic. So this is kind of what we're looking at now. As far as formal term limits, today there is a term limit of 2 terms of 4 years each, so a total of potentially 8 elected years. Now, the 2 year tradition was started by George Washington, who established this precedent when he didn't run for a third term. He only ran for 2 terms. However, this precedent is broken by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1940. Well, really in 1940 when he runs for his third term. So he wins election in 1932, 36, 40, and then again in 44. And this is in part because of his leadership through the Great Depression and World War II. So in 1951, a respectable amount of time after Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies, Congress proposes, and then the 22nd Amendment is passed, and it limits the president to 2 elected terms. Now, there is an exception. So it is possible to serve basically up to 9 years, or up to 10 years, 9 years and 364 days. So if you succeed the president, so if you become president one day over the halfway point, so let's say I'm vice president and I take over 2 years and one day into the president's term because that president dies, that doesn't count as a full term. So basically, you have to serve more than half of a term in order for it to count as a full term. So you can technically serve 9 years and 364 days. Lyndon B. Johnson could have done this. or he could have been fairly close to this after the JFK assassination. But nonetheless, more or less, 2 4-year terms is the limit. Now, there is a term and an idea known as the imperial presidency. And I'm putting this towards the beginning because I want you to keep this in mind as we go through the rest of the slideshow about the executive branch. So over time, the modern version of our presidency has gained much more power and exceeded and gone over the constitutional limits, often in kind of the modern version of the presidency. And generally, this has happened a lot kind of since the 1960s. So this starts with both Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon. So with Johnson, it's more about warfare, right? So he is able to more or less declare war, or not declare war, but use power, his presidential powers, being the commander in chief, to launch a full-scale war in Vietnam without ever declaring war through Congress. Richard Nixon was doing a lot of more illegal things like wiretapping people, the Watergate scandal, bombings of Cambodia, trying to use executive privilege in order to stop people from finding out a lot of those things. So these are two examples of kind of the growth of the president's powers, for good, bad, somewhere in between, all of the above, right? But a lot of people, political scientists, refer to the modern version of the presidency as the imperial presidency. Now, we're going to say that there are 6 roles of the president, and the acronym we're going to use is SCALED, SCALED. So we're going to do one slide on each one. So, or roughly a slide on each one. So the first constitutional role of the president starts with a C, or starts with an S, sorry, chief of state, right? So the president is the chief of state. This is kind of the informal and celebrity role. So this is the idea that the president is the representative of the United States, right? So this is everything from like pardoning turkeys on Thanksgiving to giving medals of honor, presidential medals, things like that, to meeting with other foreign leaders, to throwing out the first pitch at a baseball game. And so this is sometimes very symbolic, sometimes symbolic plus actual duties, right? But the president is expected to be the main person representing the United States of America. Okay. The president is also, in the second role, the commander in chief. So this is a constitutional power that the president has, right? The president commands the military. So the president gets to determine where to send troops. They get to command those troops. They get to hire and fire the civilian side, or the military, or the leaders of the military, predominantly on the civilian side. And this is a great example of the imperial presidency. This has expanded over time, right? This commander in chief role, right? And this is a constitutional power, right? Now, this power has been limited slightly since the 1970s after Vietnam, because Lyndon B. Johnson pushes the U.S. into war without declaring war. So Congress passed a law called the War Powers Act, or the War Powers Resolution. And basically what it means is that the president can send troops into any place in the world, use military action, but within 60 days, the president has to either get congressional authorization or a declaration of war. And if they don't get that, they have to pull them back within 30 more days after that. So prior to this, the president could more or less send the U.S. military anywhere they wanted, and Congress couldn't do a whole lot to stop them. This has been put in place. However, it's not really used much, right? So, for example, the U.S. had troops in both Iraq and Afghanistan for more than a decade, and there was never a declaration of war. There was an authorization of military force, but in a very general manner. So while this was passed as a way to limit the power of the presidency, they used it briefly at the beginning, but kind of in the modern version of the presidency has not been used much. Okay. Our third role of the president is as chief administrator. So the president basically is in charge of the bureaucracy. Now we're going to talk about this on Thursday/Friday. So we will talk about the bureaucracy much more. So the president is in charge of the bureaucracy. They appoint the directors, the leaders of the cabinet departments. They create policies within the executive branch bureaucracy. They also, as chief administrator, also appoint Supreme Court justices and other federal judges. They appoint people throughout the government, but especially in the bureaucracy and the court system. So this is the role of the chief administrator, the person in charge of the executive branch, and being in charge of all this administration work. The president is also the chief legislator. So as we've talked about, the only people who can make a law, who can propose a law or pass a law, are members of Congress. But the president can write a law, give it to a member of Congress, and influence Congress to try to pass it. Right. So the president often will set a legislative agenda in the State of the Union and in other speeches, and by pushing members of their own party in order to pass certain legislation. The more popular a president is, the better they are at that, right? So this idea from Teddy Roosevelt, this idea of the bully pulpit, right, that we talked about, where the president commands the media because the media is going to pay attention to the president. So the chief legislator is another important role of the president. While they can't pass laws, they can push for laws to be passed. The president is also the chief executive, and so the president's job, one of the constitutional jobs of the president, is to execute the laws, to enforce the laws. So kind of in a symbolic way, when the president signs a bill, the president is saying that they will enforce that law. So in addition to using the bureaucracy and using their administration to enforce laws, presidents can also sign executive orders, which have the force of laws, but don't need congressional approval and are much more likely to be overturned by the Supreme Court. The most prominent user of executive orders was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That was pretty common during his time, as you can see in that graph, right? He has the highest number of executive orders in the history of any president. So executive orders, to give you kind of the most famous example of an executive order, is Executive Order 9066, which resulted in Japanese internment during World War II. So executive orders, like, for example, Joe Biden passed an executive order to relieve student loan debt, which was relatively quickly overturned by the Supreme Court. Right? Because they don't have the kind of force of law, they are not always quite as effective. The sixth role of the president is as chief diplomat. So the president is the most important diplomat. They run the State Department, which is in part led by the Secretary of State, who reports to the president. They're going to negotiate treaties. They're going to create executive agreements. They're going to appoint ambassadors, but they do not ratify the treaties. As a reminder, the Senate ratifies treaties. That is a check that the legislative branch has over the executive. So as chief diplomat, the president meets with other countries and their representatives and their leaders, but does not have final approval over any official treaties. However, they can make executive agreements with other leaders as a way to make kind of more informal treaties. A role that's not in the Constitution is the president is the head of their political party, right? They are the highest ranking member of their political party. And so they're going to play a big role in that political party. So they're going to support the party. They're going to support candidates. They're going to raise money, and they're going to push the agenda of that political party. In fact, as a reminder, when the political platform is created, the party platform is created for a political party, it is always done it's approved at the National Convention, where they nominate a president, or a presidential nominee. So it is meant to be modeled after their belief system and their ideas. So the president also runs their political party at kind of more in a figurehead way than in a specific like powers way. Now, in the modern presidency, as a reminder, the modern version of the presidency has expanded, and that starts with FDR and continues through the 60s. It vaults even higher during the 60s and 70s. And the presidents of today are far more powerful than they were prior to FDR. So prior to FDR, and really prior to Teddy Roosevelt, most presidents, besides maybe Lincoln, Andrew Jackson, a couple other presidents, on a whole, were the least powerful of the three branches of government. Okay. But today, the executive branch is incredibly powerful, and the presidency is incredibly powerful. So let's go through some reasons why the power of the president has grown. So one reason is that since the 30s, with the implementation of the New Deal and many social programs that are introduced during the New Deal, the size of the government has increased. And so as the size of the government has increased, as we are, for example, paying Social Security to people, as the kind of Congress has created more and more things that the U.S. government does through legislation, the executive branch has to execute those laws, has to enforce those laws, has to work through the bureaucracy to make sure that the things that Congress says they are doing are getting done, right? Because Congress can't really do much by themselves. They can pass laws, they can create things, but then the executive branch is going to do those things, right? So Congress started a process, and I would argue that today that process is mostly based around partisanship, the reason for this. But the president does a lot more, and the executive branch does a lot more because Congress doesn't do quite as much as it did at one time. Okay. Another couple reasons are predominantly based on the military. Right, during the Cold War, the U.S. military grew exponentially, and so the role of the president expanded because the president had more power through the military. Also, we now have nuclear weapons, right? And so the president has the power to use those nuclear weapons as part of their role as commander in chief. Now, I want to talk about three specific powers of the president because these are ones that are mentioned a lot more on the AP test. So the an executive order, as a reminder, is basically a directive. So we talked about it earlier in this slideshow. But more or less, an executive order is a directive to agencies within the executive branch. So basically what it is, because the president can't pass a law, right, by themselves, but they can pass an executive order. So basically it orders some executive branch department or agency within the executive branch to do something. So for example, maybe this is, so when we looked at, or when we talked about Joe Biden passing or writing an executive order to provide student loan relief to people with student loan debt. He is doing that through the Department of Education and a number of other departments rather than passing a law. So this is not Congress acting. It's not legislation. It's an executive order. And again, it's not as powerful as a law because the next president can overturn it, right? Because all the next president has to do is say, oh, we're not doing this, right? So not quite as powerful. Another thing, and only write down the stuff on the left, is executive privilege. So this is the right that a president has to not divulge private communications between them, their advisors, and the people that work for them in the executive branch. And the idea is that this is if other branches of the government, the judicial branch or the legislative branch, through oversight, had the power to just know exactly what the president is doing and saying at all times, that would violate the separation of powers. And so you can't just, as president, which Richard Nixon found out, you cannot just say, oh, I have executive privilege over everything, right? So Nixon basically did not want to have to turn over tapes, which, mind you, Nixon recorded himself in the White House all the time. And he didn't want to turn over these tapes to the people investigating Watergate because he knew that there was incriminating information on it. And so he claimed, oh, I have executive privilege and I don't have to turn over this stuff. The Supreme Court said, no, you do in US v. Nixon. They said, no, you absolutely do, because executive privilege can only be brought in if it is crucial to the existence of some program or national security or something along those lines, why you can't turn over that information. Okay. And then finally, another major power of the president is that they have the appointment power. So they appoint everybody from Supreme Court justices to federal judges to ambassadors, the heads of executive agencies, the secretaries of the different cabinet departments, as well as kind of the top couple people within those cabinet departments. And so this is something that the president has a lot of power over. However, they are checked by the Senate because the Senate has to confirm these appointments. So generally, the Senate is going to confirm most appointments that are acceptable to senators from that the appointee's home state. This is something called senatorial courtesy. It's kind of an old-fashioned thing in the Senate. Like we talked about, the Senate is a much more like formal and old-fashioned body, but nonetheless, this is something that exists. Now we will talk more about kind of Supreme Court justice appointments next week when we look at the judicial branch. Okay, but the president has appointing powers. By the way, the guy up in the top right is Robert Bork, who is the last person to fail a confirmation vote. Well, not really, actually. The current Attorney General, Merrick Garland, was the last Supreme Court justice to not be appointed, but Robert Bork was kind of one of the major ones. Now, these are some of the formal powers of the president that we've talked about, but I want to categorize them for you. Formal powers are things that the Constitution says the president has the power to do, like veto legislation. The president can veto legislation, which we'll talk about in a couple slides. They can and are required to deliver the State of the Union address, right? So they have to present Congress with information with regards to the state of the United States. They get to command the military. They can call Congress into special sessions, and like we talked about on the last slide, they have the power of appointment. Now, some other powers that are often going to be referenced on AP test questions would be informal powers. So informal powers are for powers that are not something that is given to a president by the Constitution. So, for example, the president doesn't have the constitutional power over legislation, doesn't have the constitutional power to dictate what laws get passed and what don't. But because they have so much power in the US and they have so much media attention and they have so much coverage, they do truly have a large amount of influence over setting and enacting a legislative agenda. They also can pass executive orders, not in the Constitution, but something that they can do. So an informal power. They also can send out troops without a declaration of war, right? They can use military action without Congress declaring war, but they're limited in that, right? And then finally, they can conduct foreign policy initiatives. So basically, this would be like if President Joe Biden met with the president of China and they came to a minor agreement where Joe Biden is going to direct executive order departments to do things a certain way, and the president of China is going to direct China to do things in a certain way, but no law gets passed and no official treaty gets made, that would be an informal power of foreign policy initiatives. Okay. Now, there are some checks that the president has on other branches of government. So the president can, like we talked about, appoint federal judges. They can also grant reprieves. So this is predominantly on the judicial system, right? So this means that the president can postpone an execution at a federal level, not state level executions, but federal executions. The president can also grant pardons or legal forgiveness of a federal crime. They can't in the state system because they don't have power over states, right? In that manner, that's federalism. But they can give legal forgiveness for a federal crime. They can also grant amnesty. So this is basically pardoning an entire group of people. So for example, during the Vietnam War, many people were dodging the draft, right? Refusing to get drafted. And later on, the president would pardon all of them, anyone who did this specific crime. And then also the president can commute a sentence or pass commutation. So this is basically reducing a sentence. So this is going to check the judicial system. The president also has some power when it comes to the legislative branch. So one, they do the State of the Union, right? But then also, as far as checks go, they can veto a bill. So when a bill, the last step is the president has to sign it. They can veto that bill. It doesn't become a law, but it can be overturned by a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate. The president can also do a pocket veto. So basically, this is if Congress is not in session. So let's say Congress passes a bill, passes a bill, it goes to the president's desk, and they leave. They end their session of Congress. If the president doesn't do anything for 10 days, then it does not become law, and they're not vetoing the bill. For a time, the president could do a line item veto. So this is where they could veto a certain line of a bill and still sign the rest of the bill. Generally, this was used to get rid of like pork barrel spending, but it was declared unconstitutional in Clinton v. New York City in 1998 in a Supreme Court case. Okay. With regards to presidential succession, so who becomes president if the president is removed or dies, this line of succession doesn't really start until the 25th Amendment in 67. Basically, the idea was initially vice president becomes president. That's all you need. But then they realized because when they realized basically that the government realized that you need a greater line of succession just in case multiple people die or someone is not in a position, right? And then it goes to them. So, for example, the current line of succession starts with the vice president. So, if Joe Biden dies or is removed from office, Kamala Harris, the vice president, becomes president. Next in line, if both of them die or are removed or are no longer part of the government, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, would take over. Then underneath him is Patrick Leahy, the president pro tem. The president pro tem is basically the longest serving senator from the majority party in the Senate. And then next would be the Secretary of State. And below that, as you can see, is the rest of the cabinet departments secretaries. Starting with the newest, right, or the kind of most established Secretary of State, Treasury, and Defense, and then going down to Homeland Security, which is the newest. Now, this line of succession is established with the 25th Amendment in 67. 25th Amendment also dictates or creates a system where if the president is incapacitated, the cabinet can remove them from being president because they realized that with advances to modern medicine, that if the president was like in a coma and was not going to wake up, there's no way to remove them from the presidency until they die or are impeached. And they're not committing a crime if they're in a coma. So they had to create something like that. And then finally, the last thing we're going to talk about is impeachment. This is a check that the legislative branch has all over the president, right? And so this is where a federal official can be removed from office by the legislative branch. With regards to the presidency, it is going to start in the House, and the House is going to impeach the president. And so they take a vote. And basically that is like charging someone with a crime, right? So you are not guilty of a crime until you are convicted by a jury. And so the House basically charges a president with a crime. A high crime or misdemeanor is technically what it is. And then the Senate votes to determine whether they should be removed. So votes on their guilt or not. And in the Senate, that requires a 2/3 vote. So we've never had a president impeached and then removed, but we've had 3 different presidents impeached. Andrew Johnson for violating a law that was passed by Congress, that basically set up that the president couldn't fire someone without congressional approval, and he fired that person without congressional approval and was impeached. He was not removed from office by the Senate. Bill Clinton was impeached for perjury, for lying under oath, and was not removed by the Senate. And Donald Trump was impeached 2 times, one for charges of using his presidential power to try to get Ukraine trying to get Ukraine to do. Okay, go back, stop, pause. And then Donald Trump was impeached 2 times. The first time was in 2019, and this was for alleged abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. The Senate did not convict him of that, and he was not removed. And then he was later impeached after the January 6th insurrection for charges of him encouraging that insurrection. And he was not removed from office in that instance either. So there's going to be a question at the end. And we will talk about the bureaucracy, which the president runs next time.